Hello, it's great to have you here. If you like our stories, leave a like and subscribe to follow our content. The sun hung high and merciless in the cobalt expanse of the Arizona sky, a blinding white disk that seemed determined to scorch the very soul out of the earth. It was the summer of 1888, a year that would be etched into the memories of the territory's inhabitants for its brutal heat wave. Heat shimmered off the hard-packed ground in wavering lines, distorting the horizon, where the dusty browns of the desert met the jagged purple of the distant mountains. In this unforgiving landscape, silence was usually the ruler, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk or the skittering of a lizard seeking shadow. Julian Montgomery adjusted the brim of his Stetson, squinting against the glare. As the sole owner of the Golden Horizon Ranch, one of the most prosperous cattle empires in the Southwest, Julian was a man accustomed to command. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by the elements but handsome in a rugged, enduring way. His wealth was vast, evidenced not just by the thousands of heads of cattle bearing his brand, but by the sheer quality of everything he possessed, from the fine leather of his saddle to the spirited black stallion, Obsidian, beneath him. Yet despite his fortune, Julian was not a man to rule from a plush armchair. He rode his lines, knew his land, and understood the brutal temper of the West better than any city banker ever could. Today, however, something unsettled him. It wasn't the heat. He had been born and bred in this furnace. It was the sky to the west. A gathering of dark shapes circled there, a spiraling funnel of death that every cattleman recognized with a heavy heart. Vultures. A lot of them. "Easy, boy," Julian murmured, patting Obsidian's sweat-slicked neck as the horse tossed its head, sensing his rider's tension. Usually, such a sight meant a calf had strayed and fallen to a predator, or perhaps a horse had broken a leg in a badger hole, but the concentration of the birds was unusual. It suggested something larger or perhaps more numerous. A cold knot of dread tightened in Julian's stomach, defying the sweltering temperature. He spurred his horse forward, deviating from his intended path to investigate the grim spectacle. As he drew closer, the smell hit him first, the dry, metallic scent of dust mixed with something faintly organic, though not yet rotting. The terrain here was particularly harsh, a stretch of scrubland that offered no shelter, known to the locals as the Devil's Anvil. It was a place where you didn't venture without ample water and a death wish. Julian crested a low rise and pulled Obsidian to a sharp halt. The breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he stared in sheer disbelief. Below, in a shallow depression of the earth that offered no relief from the sun, lay three figures. They were not cattle, they were human. The vultures were brazen, some already hopping on the ground a few yards away, waiting with the terrifying patience of nature's undertakers. Julian shouted, a raw, guttural sound, and fired a shot from his revolver into the air. The crack of the gunshot shattered the silence, sending the black birds scattering into the sky with angry croaks. He galloped down the slope, sliding out of the saddle before the horse had even fully stopped. His heart pounded against his ribs like a war drum. As he approached, he realized they were women. 3 Native American women, Apaches by the look of their tattered deerskin dresses and the beadwork that still clung to their exhausted forms. They had been left here, abandoned to the elements and the scavengers. It was a sentence of death, cruel and slow. Julian knelt beside the first figure. She was the oldest of the 3, though still young, perhaps in her mid-20s. Her long black hair was matted with dust, and her lips were cracked and parched, stained with the dry dust of the desert. This was Nalin. Even in her semi-conscious state, her instinct was to protect. As Julian's shadow fell over her, her hand twitched weakly, reaching not for water but toward the 2 younger forms beside her. "It's all right," Julian said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his stature. "I'm not here to hurt you." He uncorked his canteen, the water inside warm but life-saving. He lifted Nalin's head carefully, supporting her neck with his strong arm. He trickled a few drops onto her lips. She didn't respond at first, but as the moisture touched her tongue, her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, deep pools of obsidian, clouded with pain but burning with a fierce, defiant intelligence. She looked at him, then at the water, and finally drank, coughing slightly as her throat worked to swallow. "Slowly," he whispered. Once she had taken a little, he moved to the next girl. Itza was younger, barely out of her teens, her breathing shallow and ragged. She was curled in a fetal position, her face buried in the dirt. Julian turned her over gently. She was lighter than he expected, her frame delicate. He repeated the process, coaxing her back from the brink. She groaned, a sound of pure suffering that tore at Julian's heart. The third, Kimmy, was hardly more than a child, perhaps 16. She lay so still that Julian feared he was too late. He checked for a pulse. It was there, thready and fast, fluttering like a trapped bird. He bathed her face with a damp handkerchief before pressing the canteen to her lips. It took agonizing minutes before she stirred, her eyelids trembling. Why? Julian muttered to himself, anger surging through him. Who would do this? He knew the answer, or at least he could guess. Tensions in the territory were high. The reservation system was failing, and rogue groups often clashed with settlers. But this and leaving 3 women to die of exposure was an act of cowardice and malice that Julian could not fathom. He couldn't leave them here. They couldn't walk, and he only had 1 horse. But Julian Montgomery was a man of resources and immense willpower. He scanned the horizon. He was miles from the main ranch house, but there was a line shack about 2 miles east, stocked with emergency supplies, and, crucially, a buckboard wagon he had left there while repairing fences earlier in the week. "I have to leave you for a short time," he told Nalin, looking directly into her eyes, hoping she understood his intent. "I will come back, I promise." He left them his canteen, placing it in Nalin's weak grip. Then he mounted Obsidian and rode like the devil himself was snapping at his heels. The heat was oppressive, but Julian felt a cold fury that drove him onward. He reached the line shack in record time, hitched the 2 sturdy mules to the buckboard, and drove them back across the rough terrain, the wagon rattling and bouncing violently. When he returned, the vultures had begun to circle again, lower this time. Julian drove the wagon practically into the midst of them, scattering the birds with shouts and curses. He leaped down, rushing to the women. They were still alive. Lifting them into the wagon was a delicate task. He started with Kimmy, lifting her as if she were made of porcelain. He laid her on the bed of blankets he had hastily thrown into the back. Next was Itza. Finally, he turned to Nalin. As he lifted her, she groaned and tried to pull away, her pride fighting against her weakness. "I've got you," Julian assured her, his grip firm and secure. "You're safe now." He placed her beside her sisters. She watched him, her gaze never leaving his face, analyzing him, judging him. There was fear there, yes, but also a profound confusion. Why was this white man, a man of obvious wealth and power, saving them? The journey back to the golden horizon was slow and agonizing. Julian drove with painstaking care, trying to avoid every rut and stone to spare his passengers further pain. He stopped frequently to offer them water, wetting their foreheads, murmuring words of reassurance, even though he wasn't sure they understood English. As the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, the grand gates of the golden horizon came into view. The main house was a sprawling mansion of white stone and timber, a testament to Julian's success. It stood like a palace in the wilderness, surrounded by lush gardens maintained at great expense. Stable hands came running as the wagon approached the main courtyard. The sight of their boss, driving a dusty buckboard with 3 unconscious figures in the back, brought the entire household to a standstill. "Mr. Montgomery!" cried Mrs. Higgins, the stout and motherly housekeeper, wiping her hands on her apron as she bustled down the porch steps. "What on earth has happened?" "Help me get them inside," Julian ordered, his voice brooking no delay. "Prepare the guest rooms in the east wing. Get clean linens, water, broth, whatever we have." The staff hesitated. They saw the dark skin, the Apache dress. In 1888, prejudice ran as deep as the roots of the saguaro cactus. "Sir," one of the ranch hands, a man named Carter, started, shifting uncomfortably. "Those are Indians. You bringing them into the main house?" Julian turned on him, his eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "I am bringing 3 human beings who have been treated worse than dogs into my home, Carter. If you have an objection, you can collect your pay and ride out tonight. Otherwise, help me lift them." The silence that followed was deafening, but Carter lowered his gaze and stepped forward to help. Mrs. Higgins, recovering her composure and guided by her Christian charity, immediately began barking orders to the maids. They carried Nalin, Itza, and Kimmy into the mansion. The contrast was jarring, the dust and grit of the desert against the polished mahogany floors, the Persian rugs, and the crystal chandeliers. They were laid in soft beds with crisp white sheets, a luxury they had likely never known. Julian did not leave their side. He oversaw everything, dismissing the initial shock of his staff with his sheer presence. He watched as Mrs. Higgins and the maids gently cleaned the dust from their faces. When the grime was washed away, Julian was struck by their features. Even in their emaciated state, they possessed a striking beauty, but it was Nalin who held his attention. Even asleep, her brow was furrowed, her hand reaching out as if searching for her sister's. Later that night, after the doctor had come and gone, shaking his head at their condition but promising they would live with proper care, Julian sat in the hallway outside their room. He held a glass of whiskey, staring into the amber liquid. He was exhausted, his clothes stained with sweat and dirt, but he felt a strange sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, not since his wife had passed. He had found something in the desert today, or perhaps something had found him. He didn't know what the future held, or how the town would react to him harboring 3 Apache women in his bachelor mansion. But as he remembered Nalin's fierce, protective eyes, Julian Montgomery knew one thing for certain. He would protect them with every ounce of his power and every dollar of his fortune. They belonged to the golden horizon now, and he would let no harm come to them again. The transition from the blinding, scorching hell of the Devil's Anvil to the cool, scented sanctuary of the golden horizon guest wing was a shock to the senses that Nalin could barely comprehend. For days, her world had been pain, thirst, and the circling shadow of death. Now she woke to a softness she had never imagined existed. She lay on a mattress filled with goose down, covered by sheets of Egyptian cotton that felt like cool water against her skin. The room was dim, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the morning sun, allowing only thin slivers of golden light to pierce the gloom. Nalin sat up instantly, a gasp escaping her lips as her instincts screamed danger. The movement made her head spin, a remnant of her dehydration, but she forced herself to focus. Her eyes darted around the room. It was a chamber fit for a queen, with wallpaper patterned in delicate floral vines, a washstand with a porcelain basin painted with bluebirds, and a wardrobe of dark, polished oak. But Nalin cared for none of these things. Her gaze landed frantically on the bed next to hers, and then the one beyond that. Itza was sleeping soundly, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that spoke of deep exhaustion but safety. Kimmy, the youngest, was also asleep, her face looking less pale than it had in the desert. Nalin let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, her hand pressing against her heart. They were alive. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Nalin's spine stiffened. She pulled the sheet up to her chin, her dark eyes narrowing into slits of mistrust. It was not the man who had saved them. It was an older woman, round and formidable, wearing a crisp black dress and a white apron so starched it could stand on its own. Mrs. Higgins carried a silver tray laden with steaming bowls. She paused when she saw Nalin sitting up, her eyebrows raising slightly. "Oh, you're awake," Mrs. Higgins said, her tone brisk but not unkind. She set the tray down on a small table. "Mr. Montgomery said you'd be fierce." I see he was right. Nalin did not understand all the words, but she understood the tone. It wasn't hostile, but it was wary. She watched as the woman poured water from a crystal pitcher into a glass. "Water," Mrs. Higgins said, enunciating clearly. She held it out. Nalin hesitated, then accepted the glass. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from weakness. She drank, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. "Food," the housekeeper said next, gesturing to the bowls. "Broth, good for the stomach." Before Nalin could respond, the door opened again. This time, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Julian Montgomery filled the doorway, his presence commanding yet strangely calming. He had traded his dusty riding clothes for a clean white shirt and a dark vest, looking every inch the master of this domain. Mrs. Higgins stepped back respectfully. "She's awake, sir. The others are still sleeping." Julian nodded to her, dismissing her with a gentle look, and stepped closer to the bed. He stopped a respectful distance away, sensing Nalin's tension. He saw the way she clutched the sheet, the way her eyes tracked his every movement like a cornered panther. "You are safe here," Julian said softly, his deep voice rumbling in the quiet room. He gestured to the window. "This is my home, golden horizon." Nalin looked at him, really looked at him for the first time without the haze of near death clouding her vision. He was a handsome man, his features sharp and defined, but his eyes were the color of the sky after a storm, gray-blue and surprisingly gentle. There was a strength in him that she recognized, a warrior's spirit wrapped in the trappings of a rich man. "Why?" she asked, her voice raspy. It was the only English word she felt confident using in this moment. Julian seemed to understand the weight of the question. It wasn't just, "Why am I here?" It was why did you save us when everyone else leaves us to die? He pulled a wooden chair closer and sat down, bringing himself to her eye level. Because no one deserves to be left for the vultures, he said simply, and because I have the power to stop it. He pointed to the broth. Eat. You need strength. Your sisters will need you to be strong. The mention of her sisters worked where his kindness had not. Nalin nodded slowly. She reached for the spoon. Her hand shook again and a drop of broth spilled onto the pristine white sheet. She froze, expecting a reprimand, a shout, a blow, reactions she had learned to expect from white settlers. Instead, Julian merely reached out, took the napkin from the tray and gently dabbed the spot. It washes out, he said with a faint smile. Eat. Over the next week, the Golden Horizon became a place of strange transformation. For Nalin, Itza, and Kimmy, it was a slow journey back to life. The luxury that surrounded them was overwhelming. They were bathed in warm water in a copper tub large enough to swim in. They were given soft nightgowns of silk and cotton that felt impossibly light against their skin. Kimmy, young and resilient, recovered the fastest. She was soon sitting up, laughing at the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, fascinated by the mechanics of the civilized world. Itza was quieter, shadowing Nalin, her eyes wide with wonder as she touched the velvet curtains or the smooth wood of the furniture. But for the household, the adjustment was more turbulent. The staff whispered. The maids, girls from the local town, would stop talking whenever Julian walked by, but he could hear the hissed words, savages, wild women. What is the master thinking? Julian ignored them, but he could not ignore the town. On a Tuesday, Julian rode into the nearby town of Silver Creek to visit the bank and the general store. He took the carriage, intending to buy fabric. The deerskin dresses the women had arrived in were ruined, and he wanted them to have proper clothes, not just servants' cast-offs, but new garments. As he walked down the wooden boardwalk, the usual greetings were muted. Men who usually tipped their hats to the wealthiest landowner in the county now averted their eyes or stared with open curiosity. Inside the general store, the silence was thick enough to cut with a knife. Silas Thorne, the store owner, leaned over the counter, chewing on a toothpick. "Morning, Mr. Montgomery," Silas said, his tone lacking its usual obsequious warmth. "Hear you got some guests at the ranch." Julian didn't look up from the bolt of blue calico he was examining. "I do, Silas. 3 of them. Apache, they say," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Folks are talking, Julian, saying it ain't right, keeping wild Indians in a house like yours. It's unnatural. Some are worried about safety. You know how they are, thieves, murderers." Julian slowly set the fabric down. He turned his cold, steel-gray gaze on the storekeeper. The shop went deadly silent. "Let me be clear, Silas," Julian said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "The women in my house were left to die by cowards. They are under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with my guests has a problem with me. And you know that this town survives because of the business the Golden Horizon brings." He leaned in closer. "Are we understood?" Silas swallowed hard, the toothpick bobbing nervously. "Crystal clear, Mr. Montgomery. Just passing on the word is all." "Pass this on," Julian said, tossing a gold coin onto the counter. "I want this fabric and 3 pairs of your best leather boots, delivered by this afternoon. And if I hear one more word of disrespect spoken about them, I'll take my accounts to Tucson." He walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. But as he rode back to the ranch, Julian knew the trouble was just beginning. He had drawn a line in the sand. When he returned to the ranch, the sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the veranda. He found Nalin there. She had ventured out of the room for the first time, wearing a simple robe Mrs. Higgins had found for her. She was standing by the railing, looking out toward the distant mountains, her profile sharp and elegant against the twilight. She looked different now, clean, her hair brushed into a shining curtain of black silk down her back. The hollows in her cheeks were filling out, and her skin glowed with returning health. Julian paused at the bottom of the steps, struck by her beauty. It wasn't the delicate, powdered beauty of the women he met at social balls. It was raw, powerful, and breathtaking. Nalin turned as she heard his boots on the gravel. She didn't flinch this time. She watched him approach. "You went to the village," she stated. Her English was improving rapidly. She listened to everything the maid said, absorbing the language like a sponge. "I did," Julian replied, mounting the steps to stand beside her. "They do not like us here," she said. It wasn't a question. "I can feel it in the air. The servants, they look at us with fear." They fear what they don't understand, Julian said, resting his hands on the railing, close to hers, but not touching. But this is my land, my rules. You are welcome here, Nalin. Why? She asked again, turning to face him fully. You are a rich man. You have many cows, many horses. We have nothing. We are, what is the word? Burdens? Julian turned to her. The distance between them seemed to shrink, the air charged with an unspoken electricity. You are not a burden. Since my wife died 5 years ago, this house has been a tomb, big, cold, and empty. You and your sisters, you have brought life back into it. I saved you, yes, but perhaps, he hesitated, feeling foolish for admitting it. Perhaps I needed saving too. Nalin studied him, her dark eyes searching his soul. She saw the loneliness hidden behind the wealth. She saw a man who was tired of being surrounded by people who only wanted his money. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and placed her hand over his on the railing. Her skin was warm, her fingers strong. Then we will stay, she whispered, for now. The touch sent a jolt through Julian that had nothing to do with the heat of the evening. It was a promise, a connection that transcended language and culture. Below them, in the shadows of the garden, a stable hand watched, his eyes narrowing, before he turned and slipped away into the darkness, heading toward the town to sell the news that Julian Montgomery wasn't just harboring Apaches, he was falling in love with one. Hey there, where in the world are you watching this story from? We'd love to know our audience better. Please leave a comment below with your city or country, and don't forget to subscribe for the next chapter. The peace that had settled over the golden horizon was as fragile as a spiderweb in a gale. 2 weeks had passed since the rescue, and while the interior of the mansion had transformed into a haven of laughter and healing, the atmosphere outside was thickening with a suffocating tension. Inside, Itza and Kimmy were blooming. They had taken to the domestic rhythms of the house with surprising ease, helping Mrs. Higgins with the baking, their nimble fingers weaving dough as expertly as they had once woven baskets. But Nalin remained a creature of the wild, pacing the polished floors like a panther in a gilded cage, her eyes always turning to the windows, to the open land. The break came on a Thursday morning, arriving not with the sun, but with the thunder of hooves and shouting men. Julian was already awake, sipping black coffee in his study, when the door burst open. It was Thomas, his foreman, a man of few words and leather-tough skin. He held his hat in his hands, crushing the brim, his face grim. "Bad news, boss," Thomas rumbled, his voice tight. "The south pasture, the fence is cut. 50 head of the new breeding stock, gone." Julian slammed his cup down, coffee sloshing onto the mahogany desk. "Gone? How? We have patrols riding that line every night." "That's just it," Thomas said, shifting his weight, his eyes darting toward the hallway where the guest rooms were. "Whoever did it knew exactly when the boys were switching shifts. They knew the terrain. And well, they're talking, Julian. They're saying it ain't a coincidence." Julian stood up, towering over the desk. "Spit it out, Thomas." "They're blaming the women," Thomas said bluntly. "Saying they're spies, signaling their kin in the hills, telling them when to strike. Carter's got the boys riled up, says we're harboring vipers." Julian grabbed his gun belt from the rack, strapping it on with swift, angry movements. "I'll handle Carter, saddle Obsidian, and get the men ready to ride. We're getting those cattle back." He strode out of the study, his spurs chiming on the floorboards, only to find his path blocked. Nalin stood in the hallway. She was dressed in the riding clothes Julian had ordered for her, a split skirt of dark blue wool and a white blouse, but she wore moccasins instead of boots, refusing to silence her steps. She had heard everything. "I will come," she said. Her voice was calm, contrasting with the fury radiating from Julian. "No," Julian said, trying to step around her. "It's too dangerous. And the men are looking for someone to blame. I won't have you in the crossfire." "They blame me already," Nalin countered, stepping in front of him again. Her obsidian eyes locked onto his. "They think my people stole your cows. If you go alone, you look for heavy tracks, for noise. White men ride heavy. My people ride like the wind. If it was Apaches, you will never find them. If it was not, I will show you." Julian looked at her. He saw the fierce determination, the warrior spirit that refused to be coddled. He realized then that leaving her behind was impossible. She needed to prove this as much as he needed to find his herd. "Can you ride a saddle?" he asked. "I can ride anything," she replied. 10 minutes later, the courtyard was a chaotic swirl of men and horses. The ranch hands were gathered, muttering darkly, casting hostile glares as Julian emerged with Nalin by his side. Carter, the man Julian had reprimanded the day they arrived, spat on the ground near Nalin's feet. "This is a mistake, boss," Carter sneered, his hand resting near his pistol. "Bringing a squaw to hunt rustlers? She'll likely lead us into an ambush." Julian swung into the saddle of his black stallion, his face a mask of cold authority. "Nalin is here to track. Anyone who has a problem with that can stay behind and explain to me later why they were too scared to ride. We have cattle to find. Move out." The group thundered out of the gates, a dozen men heavily armed. The ride to the south pasture was silent and tense. When they reached the cut fence, the destruction was obvious. The wire had been snipped cleanly, the posts dragged aside. The men milled about, pointing at the churned earth. "Look at that mess," Carter shouted, pointing to a confused jumble of hoofprints. "Heading south toward the canyons, straight into Apache territory, I told you." Nalin slid off her horse. She ignored the men, ignored the insults. She crouched low, her fingers brushing the dirt. She moved slowly, analyzing the ground in a way the cowboys didn't understand. She touched a broken twig of sagebrush, examined a scuff mark on a rock, and sifted the dust through her fingers. After a long moment, she stood up and walked to Julian. "Not Apache," she said clearly, her voice carrying over the wind. Carter laughed harshly. "Of course she'd say that. She's covering for them." Nalin turned to him, her expression icy. "Apache horses are unshod. They leave a smooth print. These horses have iron shoes, and one of them," she pointed to a faint track, "one has a crack in the left rear shoe. It leaves a split mark. And they did not go south. They turned the herd east onto the hard rock to hide the trail." Julian looked at where she pointed. To his eyes, it was just rocky ground, but he trusted her. He felt it in his gut. "We go east," Julian commanded. "Boss, the tracks clearly go south," Carter protested. "How you follow the decoy trail if you want, Carter," Julian snapped. "I'm following the tracker. Let's go." Julian turned Obsidian east, and Nalin mounted her horse, a spirited mare she managed with only her knees and a light touch on the reins, and rode beside him. The other men, grumbling but unwilling to defy the boss, followed. For hours they rode across the punishing terrain. The heat beat down on them, relentless and heavy. Nalin led them across slate, through dry riverbeds and over ridges where no obvious trail existed. More than once the men wanted to turn back, but every time doubt arose, Nalin would find a sign, a smear of manure, a thread of denim caught on a cactus thorn, that proved they were on the right path. By late afternoon they reached the entrance to Dead Man's Box, a hidden canyon with steep, red-walled sides, known for being a hideout for outlaws. The smell of smoke and cattle drifted on the breeze. Julian signaled for silence. He dismounted and crept to the ridge, pulling his Winchester rifle from its scabbard. Nalin was right beside him, moving so silently she seemed like a shadow. Below them, in the canyon floor, was the missing herd, and around a campfire, laughing and drinking whiskey, were 6 men. They were not Apaches. They were white men, rough-looking drifters. And sitting among them, looking distinctively nervous, was a man Julian recognized, a former hand he had fired for drunkenness months ago. "Well," Julian whispered, a grim satisfaction settling in his chest. "Looks like you were right." He glanced at Nalin. She didn't smile. She was scanning the canyon walls, her eyes narrowing. Suddenly, she gripped Julian's arm, her fingers digging into his muscle. "Above!" she hissed. "Look out!" A rifle crack echoed through the canyon before Julian even registered the threat. A bullet kicked up dirt inches from his face. A sentry, hidden high in the rocks on the opposite side, had spotted them. "Ambush! Take cover!" Julian roared, rolling behind a boulder and dragging Nalin with him. The peaceful canyon erupted into chaos. The rustlers below scrambled for their guns, firing wildly up at the ridge. Julian's men returned fire, the roar of Colts and Winchesters deafening in the enclosed space. Julian propped his rifle on the rock, taking aim. He dropped one of the men by the fire, but the sentry above had them pinned down. Bullets chipped away at their cover, sending stone shards flying. "I can't get a shot at him," Julian yelled over the din. "Sun's in my eyes." Nalin scanned the terrain. "Cover me," she said. "What? No!" Julian shouted, grabbing for her, but she was already gone. She didn't run away. She ran sideways, diving from rock to rock with an agility that left Julian breathless. She wasn't armed with a gun. Before leaving the ranch, she had fashioned a crude sling from leather strips, a weapon she had used since childhood. She moved to a lower outcrop flanking the sentry's position, while Julian drew the man's fire. The sentry, focused on the rancher, didn't see the lithe figure moving through the scrub oak. Nalin picked up a smooth, heavy stone from the creek bed. She spun the sling, the hum of the lever lost in the gunfire. With a sharp snap of her wrist, she released it. The stone flew true, striking the sentry squarely in the temple. He crumpled without a sound, his rifle clattering down the cliff face. "He is down!" Nalin shouted. With the high ground clear, the tide of the battle turned instantly. "Push forward," Julian commanded. His men poured fire into the canyon floor. The remaining rustlers, seeing their advantage lost and their numbers thinning, threw down their guns and raised their hands in surrender. The ride back to the golden horizon was a procession of victory. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of violet and gold, mirroring the adrenaline that still coursed through Julian's veins. They drove the cattle ahead of them, the herd lowing softly. The mood among the men had shifted entirely. There was no more grumbling. Carter rode with his head down, ashamed. The other hands cast glances of awe toward Nalin, who rode with her back straight, looking straight ahead, neither seeking nor acknowledging their approval. Julian dropped back to ride beside her. The dust of the trail coated their clothes, and streaks of gunpowder stained Julian's cheek. "You saved my life back there," Julian said, his voice low, meant only for her. "That sentry had me dead to rights." Nalin looked at him. The adrenaline had faded, leaving her tired but alert. "You gave me water when I was dying," she replied simply. "A life for a life." "It's more than that," Julian insisted. He reached out, and this time he took her hand firmly. He didn't care who saw. "You proved them all wrong. You showed them what honor looks like. You are extraordinary, Nalin." She looked down at their joined hands, his large, calloused, white, hers smaller, darker, scarred by survival. "They respect strength," she observed, nodding toward the cowboys ahead. "Today I showed them strength, but tomorrow they will remember I am Apache." "Let them remember," Julian said fiercely, squeezing her hand. "Let them remember that the future mistress of Golden Horizon is a warrior who saved their hides." Nalin's breath hitched. Mistress of Golden Horizon. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and danger. She looked at him, searching for deceit, but found only an intense, burning admiration. "You speak boldly, Julian Montgomery," she whispered, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time that day. "I speak the truth," he replied, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles, ignoring the dirt and the blood. "And I intend to prove it." As they rode through the ranch gates, the stars beginning to prick the velvet sky, the barriers between them had crumbled completely. They were no longer just rescuer and rescued. They were partners forged in fire. But as Julian looked toward the main house, he knew the battle with the rustlers was the easy part. The real war, for acceptance, for their future, and against the rigid society of 1888, was just beginning, and he was ready to burn the whole world down to keep her by his side. The harvest moon hung low and heavy over the Arizona territory, casting a silver sheen over the Golden Horizon Ranch. In the weeks following the shootout at Dead Man's Box, the atmosphere at the ranch had undergone a seismic shift. The whispers of savage and witch had vanished, replaced by a quiet, reverent respect. The ranch hands, rough men who valued grit above all else, now tipped their hats when Nalin walked by. Carter, the man who had once spat at her feet, had spent 3 days carving a complex wooden doll for Kimi, a silent offering of apology. Inside the mansion, however, a different kind of battle was being prepared for. The governor's autumn ball in Tucson was the social event of the year, a gathering of the territory's wealthiest cattle barons, mining magnates, and politicians. It was a world of rigid rules, porcelain teacups and sharp tongues, a world far more dangerous to Nalin than a canyon full of rustlers. Julian stood in the library, nursing a brandy, watching Nalin as she practiced walking in the new gown he had commissioned from a French dressmaker in San Francisco. It was a masterpiece of emerald green silk, trimmed with black lace, designed to accentuate her strength rather than hide it. "It is heavy," Nalin murmured, adjusting the bustle. She looked at her reflection in the tall mirror, her expression unreadable, like wearing a saddle. Julian chuckled softly, setting his glass down. "It is armor, Nalin, just of a different kind. Tonight we walk into the lion's den. They will be waiting for you to stumble. They will be waiting for you to be the wild thing they whisper about." Nalin turned to him. Her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, secured with a comb of silver and turquoise, a blend of her heritage and his gift. "I will not stumble," she said, her chin lifting. "I survived the desert. I can survive a room full of women in corsets." Julian crossed the room and took her hands. "I know you can, but remember, you don't have to prove anything to them. You are there as my partner, as the future of this ranch." The journey to Tucson was made in Julian's finest carriage, a black lacquer brougham with plush velvet seats. Itza and Kimi had stayed behind, safe under the watchful and now fiercely protective eyes of Mrs. Higgins and the ranch staff. When they arrived at the Grand Hotel ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and cigar smoke. A string quartet played a Strauss waltz, the music floating over the murmur of 100 conversations. As the doorman announced, "Mr. Julian Montgomery and guest," the room did not just go quiet, it seemed to freeze. Every head turned. Fans stopped fluttering. Glasses were lowered. Julian offered Nalin his arm. "Head high," he whispered. "Look them in the eye." They descended the grand staircase. Nalin felt the weight of the stairs. Curiosity, judgment, hostility. She felt like a prize mare being inspected at an auction, but she channeled the spirit of her ancestors. She moved with a grace that no deportment school could teach, a fluid, predatory elegance that made the stiff movements of the other women look clumsy by comparison. At the bottom of the stairs, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, though less from reverence and more from shock. A woman stepped forward, Mrs. Cornelia Vance, the wife of the local banker and the self-appointed queen of Tucson society. She was dripping in diamonds, her face pinched with disdain. "Julian," Mrs. Vance said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "We were so surprised to hear you were coming and, oh my, you've brought your charity case. Is it safe? I hear Apaches can be quite unpredictable indoors." A titter of nervous laughter rippled through the circle of onlookers. Julian's expression didn't change, but Nalin felt the muscles in his arm turn to steel. Before he could speak, Nalin stepped forward. She looked Mrs. Vance up and down, her dark eyes piercing. "The desert teaches us that safety is an illusion, Mrs. Vance," Nalin said, her English crisp and accented but perfectly understandable. "But I have found more honor in the silence of the canyons than in the noise of this room. As for unpredictable, I only attack when provoked." "Are you provoking me?" The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Vance's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. She had expected a mute savage. She had encountered a queen. Julian laughed, a rich, genuine sound that broke the tension. "I believe you have your answer, Cornelia. Now, if you'll excuse us, I promised this lady a dance." He swept Nalin onto the dance floor. He had spent the last week teaching her the waltz in the privacy of his library, counting steps until late into the night. Now, they moved as one. Nalin, a quick study in all things, followed his lead effortlessly. The emerald dress swirled around them, a vortex of color among the sea of drab pastels. As they spun, the rest of the room began to fade away. There was only the music, the warmth of Julian's hand on her waist, and the look in his eyes, a look of absolute, consuming adoration. "You were magnificent," Julian whispered against her ear. "She was like a rattlesnake," Nalin murmured back, a small smile playing on her lips. "Loud rattle, no venom." "I love you," Julian said. He hadn't meant to say it then, in the middle of a waltz, surrounded by the elite of Arizona. But the words tumbled out, driven by the overwhelming pride and passion he felt for the woman in his arms. Nalin missed a step. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. The music seemed to slow. "You love me. I have loved you since I found you in the dust," Julian confessed, pulling her slightly closer. "I love your strength. I love your fire. I love how you protect your sisters. I want to wake up every day and see you looking out over the golden horizon. I want you to be my wife, Nalin, not my guest, my wife." The song ended. They stood in the center of the floor, breathless. The crowd, seeing the intensity of the moment, had begun to whisper again, but the tone had shifted. It was no longer just scandal. It was the undeniable recognition of a romance so bold it demanded respect. Nalin looked at this man, this white rancher who had defied his own people to save hers, who had treated her with nothing but honor. She thought of the life they had built in the last month, the peace she felt at the ranch. "People will talk," she whispered. "They will say you married a savage." "Let them talk," Julian replied, his voice ringing out clearly enough for the nearby couples to hear. "I'd rather be judged by fools than live without my heart." He went down on one knee. A collective gasp went through the room. In 1888, a man of his stature kneeling before an Apache woman was unheard of. It was a revolution. "Nalin," Julian said, pulling a ring from his vest pocket, a simple gold band set with a diamond as clear as water. "Will you marry me?" Nalin looked at the ring, then at the faces of the crowd, shocked, scandalized, envious. Then she looked at Julian. She saw her future in his grey eyes. "Yes," she said loud and clear, "I will." The wedding took place 3 months later, in the blossoming spring of 1889. It was not held in the stuffy church in town, but in the gardens of the Golden Horizon, beneath the vast canopy of the sky. It was a ceremony that bridged 2 worlds. A preacher from Tucson officiated, but at Nalin's request, the vows were exchanged while standing on a woven blanket, an Apache symbol of a shared path. Nalin wore white, but she had embroidered the bodice with traditional beadwork in patterns of protection and longevity. Itza and Kimmy stood as her bridesmaids, dressed in pale blue, their faces beaming with joy. They had found their place here too. Itza was showing a remarkable talent for horse training, working alongside the stable master, while Kimmy had begun to study with a tutor Julian had hired, devouring books with a hunger that rivaled Julian's own. The guest list was a strange mix. The ranch hands stood scrubbed and polished in their Sunday best on one side. On the other, a few brave souls from town who had been won over by Julian's defiance and Nalin's dignity. And watching from the distant ridge, a group of Apache riders sat on their horses, kin who had heard of the marriage and come to witness it from afar, a silent truce in a turbulent land. When Julian kissed his bride, a cheer went up that shook the leaves of the cottonwood trees. It was a sound of pure triumph. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in the signature gold that gave the ranch its name, Julian and Nalin stood on the veranda. The party was winding down inside. The fiddle music was soft and low. Julian wrapped his arms around Nalin from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. They looked out over the thousands of acres of land, the cattle grazing peacefully, the wild, untamed beauty of the West. "Mrs. Montgomery," Julian tested the name, savoring it. "It is a long name," Nalin laughed softly, leaning back into him, "but I think I will keep it." "We will build a legacy here, Nalin," Julian promised. "A place where blood doesn't matter as much as spirit. A place where your sisters can grow old in safety." Nalin placed her hand over his, feeling the beat of his heart against her back. She thought of the vultures circling in the desert, of the heat and the despair. And then she looked at the golden light flooding the land. "Her land. We already have," she whispered. The road ahead would not be easy. The world was changing, and prejudice was a weed with deep roots. But as the first stars appeared in the twilight, Nalin knew that together they were unshakable. They had forged a love in the furnace of the desert, tempered it in the face of hatred, and polished it with unwavering loyalty. And that, she knew, was the only gold that truly mattered. The true measure of a person's worth is not found in their lineage, the color of their skin, or their social standing, but in the integrity of their actions and the content of their character. While prejudice seeks to divide and destroy based on ignorance, love and courage have the power to bridge the widest chasms. Julian and Nalin's story teaches us that dignity is inherent in every human being, and that standing up for what is right, even when the whole world stands against you, is the ultimate act of nobility. Hello everyone. To be part of our community, leave your like and subscribe to the channel.